All right, YouTubers, welcome. I'm going to go through some conspiracies and mostly economic American conspiracies, wartime, central banking, that kind of stuff. So, some of my favorite wacko theories. I don't support all of them. I'm just not even supporting them in general. They're fascinating to kind of go through and get weirdo point of views. And so origins of this is that, usually you have some unexplained events. I'm not going to do like UFOs and stuff like that and Bermuda Triangles. I'm going to do more like semi-real stuff that can be sort of traced and as alternative American history, right? Not taught in the things. There's a lot of YouTubes on video, and some of them drone on for a really long time on these subjects. So yeah, hour and a half, 2 hour videos. I'm going to try to speed it up some, but I'm not going to go into that much detail because I just don't have that much time. But hopefully you can research some of these on your own. They're always out there on YouTube and websites as a lot of this stuff started in the 80s or with the advent of the internet and non-controlled newspaper sources and journalists that always used to be controlled and could control us, and now it's less controlling. So there's some unexplained events out there, or events that have been explained in a certain way, and sometimes you say, hey, does that make sense or not? Some of these conspiracy theories have, obviously have some merit, right, as at least plausible or possible, and usually they can't be disproved entirely. So you just say I can't disprove something that didn't happen exactly that way or whatever. Usually the basis of it is some manipulation and misdirection by the wealthy and powerful, or something like that, for money and power, and or usually there's a lot of circumstantial evidence involved where it's like, oh, that's a little curious, right? And that doesn't always mean it's true, but circumstantial evidence is circumstantial evidence. I think it's a little fun to look at this stuff, or just try to look at alternate things. Some of it doesn't change my, can't really change what you do in the world, but it's like, oh, that maybe makes some sense, and then you try to piece some things together, and there's more of these tactics getting pieced together over time. But usually the propagation or propaganda is to dismiss people who espouse these theories as wacko or crazy, or the people themselves as wacko or crazy, and that's it's crazy talk, right? And so it's fun to have some crazy people around, but a lot of it is may not be true, right? So I'm going to have a timeline out here, and I'm put the significant events up top, like the Bank of England, Central Banking Act of 1871, Jekyll Island, Titanic, Federal Reserve, women voting, bankruptcy, Social Security, Hitler, Reagan assassination, and 9/11. And there's some stuff underneath it, like the wars and the panics and the civil wars and panics in World War II and gold standard stuff. So defined our economy. I've done some other videos on our debt and that type of stuff, and should be scared or not scared. But the big conspiracy theory that came about in the 80s and 90s, and it traces back to the 30s, and it's basically we're all just collateral against the American debt. So the general view is American citizens are sovereign and free, and we pay stuff like taxes voluntarily to help pay for universal needs. And this is the core of a lot of this controlling stuff that I've got, like the international banking cartel and the Jesuits, the U.S. citizens or corporations, Social Security numbers, the Fed, private monetary control, Titanic being sunk, American bankruptcy, and some other stuff, right? The alternate view is that taxes obligate the U.S. citizens as indentured servants to pay debt interest to the International Banking Fund, which made those loans and control everything. So I'm going to break down some of these. This is sort of just a slide to set up, much like the timeline was. So let's talk about the Fed. The Fed is the Federal Reserve, private banking. And so the Fed is kind of admits it's private. It's not. It's on behalf of the American government. The American government defers to them to do that work. Specialty work, sort of farms it out, per se, you could call it, but it's in the Constitution, right? So it regulates American currency and policies on behalf of the government, no doubt about that. They spin a lot of stuff. They do funky little caricatures to show that, we're benign, right? But there's been a battle ever since the inception of the USA, right after the fight for independence, for a privately controlled central bank. So people want it, powerful people, rich people, who make the decisions in America in general. good portion of them wanted it because they'll become wealthy and become controlling, and it was there were some people who were against it too, and the average citizen has historically been against it, but we've been over 100 years with the Fed, so people don't know any different now. But the origins of a private central bank began in 1600s England with like the Rothschild family, and they're able to print money out of, on behalf of the government, so they can never really go bankrupt, and they can control a lot of stuff by printing money. So England did it, and so when people came over here, they wanted to repeat the same thing because under the guise of stabilization or whatever it is. And so there were, early on in America, several private banks existed in the USA history, and a lot of people who just won a war from Britain and unfair taxation and all that stuff didn't want to put the banking of England back in place, right? So, but nonetheless, about 1791, we got our first central bank. Slightly after 1790, we sort of got the government budget up and going and stuff like that, and the first congresses. So, and they did them on 20-year charters for fairness, right? So that, if we don't like it, if it's peaceful, we'll expire it and we'll go back to, non-centralized banks or government money or whatever it was. Money was a lot different back in, the 1800s and 1700s. So there was a 20-year existence, and then there's a little break from 1811 to 1816, and then there was another 20-year existence. And then there was basically, that one expired too in 1836, and there was some stuff in between, but basically we were about 70, 80 years of free. Then eventually the Fed itself, the Federal Reserve, with the Federal Reserve notes replacing other stuff, was the 16th Amendment, which was passed in 1913. A lot of the proponents of that had a secret meeting in the Jekyll Island back in 1910. That'll come back again and again because they were trying to find a way to get these central banks back in, because that's the mother, sort of the USA is sort of the mother lode. So a lot of these Rothschild, Rockefeller, Morgan type people had their proponents meet on the Jekyll Island, and some say it goes back to the Jesuits and the Vatican and the Roman Catholic type control of the world. So that's the wackadoo theory. But private interests, those controlling that money, will create financial panic when attempts to oppose occur. So like the end of the first banking thing, 1811, they had a war of 1812. They went out, in theory, and made a war, right, to need the requirement to loan money and re-centralize it, and it worked. And in 1837, we happened to have a nice big panic right after that one expired, but it didn't immediately get us back, and we still had a lot of peacetime. There's a war in 1865. That was our Civil War, right, that some created. Some say we're another attempt. Forget the freedom of slaves, Negro slaves. It was, trying to, again, this banking back and forth, and there's some evidence to that. I skipped 1871 there, but 1907 there was obviously a huge panic, and that's eventually what brought about the amendment, the 16th Amendment, that got the Federal Reserve in there, and ultimately it's the 1929 panic that sent us into a spiral of hell, where we've been debt involved ever since. If you ever look at our debt, and some of my other theories or conspiracies that I've looked up go along with that. So the alternate view is the Fed is the private arm of the elite New World Order, and go ahead and disprove it, right? So along the way, the Titanic happened in 1912. It was deemed an unsinkable ship that hit an iceberg and goes down as a disaster. That's most people think. They see the movie, they've seen all the highlights, they've learned it throughout their life. Happened during its maiden voyage. It was sunk in 1812. Obviously, it did hit an iceberg and went down and killed, 1,500 people, and 700 people survived. There were no life rafts and stuff, not enough life rafts and all the other stuff. You've seen the movie, right? Must be real, right? A lot of other conspiracy theories say that was actually the Olympic, the Olympic that didn't work so well, and they switched the names, and there's actually some theoretical evidence of that, because it was an inside job, right, basically. And so, interestingly enough, in 1898, there was a book published called The Wreck of the Titan. It was a super liner, same sort of size, 800 footish, capable of 20 to 25 knots. It was deemed unsinkable, hit an iceberg, and there was a lack of lifeboats. Same as the Titanic that happened 14 years later, right? And the author was poisoned a few years after the Titanic. So this is all conspiracy theory type stuff. But it is interesting that maybe someone who was elite just read that book and said, well, let's go replicate that. Titanic, pretty close, pretty good forebearer of what happened. But more damning is stuff like J.P. Morgan built and funded the ship. And Morgan and Hershey of the Hershey fame canceled at the last minute, and they were both huge central bank proponents, wealthy people on the central bank side doing the deed. Like I said, there were quite a few that survived, but quite even more died. Now, the people who died were interesting on that ship. It was, and obviously Morgan and Hershey canceled at the last minute, so everybody thought it was going to be a nice luxury float about. But Guggenheim, Strauss, and Astor are the most common as super wealthy. I think their net worth at that time was like $500 million, which is a significant amount. And they were opponents of the private central bank that were aboard and went down with the ship. And so when that happened, immediately there was a resolution to go through the Congress to pass the central banking. It was under some guy's name. I don't remember the guy's name. That didn't quite go over because they knew that he was on board, so they named it with somebody else and reintroduced it. And so by 1913 we had the 16th Amendment, and the Fed was in place, and we've done private central banking ever since. But it's just it's just a coincidence, right, that those opponents went down on the ship, and the ones who didn't canceled out at the last minute, right? So the alternate view is the Titanic was sunk to facilitate the Fed and the 16th Amendment by the Jekyll Island crew. So look it up. Very interesting. Hasn't been disproven per se, and more evidence comes out all the time. Definitely Jekyll Island did happen. It took till 1960s to get one of the guys to admit it, because it's all hush-hush secret stuff. So the next conspiracy theory along that is that, it's a little later in our life here, but I'll be doing the timeline again, is that the USA actually went bankrupt, and there was a corporation called the U.S. that replaced it, and it was all backed by the International Banking Fund, those Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and other people that control the world, or at least as much as they can. They get more and more bit by bit. So the general view is the United States of America is the United States, capital United States. You see this in documents intermittently before and after certain points in time. And we are not bankrupt nor controlled by international interests. So the U.S. is the U.S. We're still a collection of states, and with no international interests. We have no debt. We are not bankrupt, etc., etc. And there's some truth and not truth to that. But the timeline again is the Civil War, and then we had the Act of 1871. The Act of 1871, basically, I repeat it below. It's about District of Columbia and officially getting a government and basically corporation definitions, and the United States was capitalized. So there was a panic in 1907, and the 13th Amendment set up the Fed. You had the World War I, and the panic in 1929, where they controlled interest rates and everybody was in debt, including the U.S. And then 1930 to 1933 brought about bankruptcy, and 1933 was the official Roosevelt declaration that we were bankrupt. Collected our gold thereafter. It was mandatory to turn in your gold, get off the gold, so that now you know nothing. You didn't even have gold, right? So you definitely were not enforcing laws at that point in time. So very interesting history that usually you get canceled out in middle school. You get to, you did all the ones before 1813, right? And then there was a little bit about 1813, right? And the Fed and the women voting, and then World War II and World War I and World War II. Modern American history, but you didn't get that a lot in school. So it's interesting to read that time period and with respect to these conspiracies. So the Act of 1871 established the District of Columbia government and a corporation called the United States Capitol that operates in D.C. under private international law, not common law like we had prior and like the states had and like the United States of America went with. Now you officially had a corporation, so basically the Congress sold us all out. We didn't know it. We're not smart enough. We're not lawyers. We didn't know that, and there was no way to tell a whole lot anyways. So eventually the District of Columbia got the states to report to it by default, and et cetera, right, under several guises throughout 1871 to the death nails in 1913 and eventually 1933. Got us where we are. So originally the Constitution for the United States of America was uncapitalized United States, capital America. So capitalization is important, and it was Constitution for the United States, right? those states of America, and it was replaced with capital, the Constitution of the United States of America. And so that's where the conspiracy theories say that the Constitution was actually switched. We became, the old Constitution that gave us all our Bill of Rights and all that became null and void. And it's all about a small, independent corporation government dictated by maritime law or private international law that got its fingers around America, and eventually the tyranny kicked in, and all the states fell in line. So a lot to that. If you look at the U.S. Code, Title 28, that originated back in like 1873, so just after the 1871, after we made a corporation. It actually, Section 302 defines the United States as a corporation. Now, a lot of people argue that's talking about corporations in America, but it can be equally read either way. So the U.S. Code is that's a big code, but that started just after that, and this certainly talks about corporations and capitalization and maritime laws and private international law, and that, so you say a lot of stuff you say that's unconstitutional. Well, they're not required to abide by the Constitution. They're a international corporation in Washington, D.C., and could care less. They operate by those laws, international laws dictated to them. So Roosevelt declared bankruptcy in the House Joint Resolution 192-10. If you just look up bankruptcy USA 1933 in your Google search, that'll come up, and shortly thereafter, citizens were ordered to surrender gold. He basically declared us bankruptcy. Now, the U.S. can't be bankrupt, but he meant it in a literal sense, or figurative sense, right? That, we didn't have any money anymore. We were pretty destitute. International bankers had jacked up the rate. We were pretty desperate, right? As a country, we came out of World War I. We didn't really want to go back into World War II. And we were having a big depression, as was much of the world, because the people who do these type of loaning set it up to put us a lot of debt. And so nations don't really become bankrupt. They go into sovereign default if they fail to pay debts. And the U.S. really won't become a sovereign default as long as we can print our own money and have our own currency and have our own international standards. So we technically won't be bankrupt, but effectively, the wording that was used was in that House Joint Resolution was bankruptcy, and we've always been in bankruptcy. So it's kind of mind-blowing. Legal stuff is the alternate view. When you get around, you say, hey, I'm not a lawyer, but this makes it, people make pretty good arguments on this type of stuff. So effectively, to loan the money, I thought I had this somewhere in there. Maybe it's in the next one. It is the next one. So it's you, capital U, the corporation, right? So additionally, there's a diabolical scheme that when we're born, just like we get cargo documents, birthing documents, right, in the maritime law, we get birth certificates. We usually get a copy of our birth certificate. And matter of fact, we get, because the original is filed, they say, right, they file it, you have 14 days to pick it up, but nobody knows you have 14 days to pick it up. So once you don't pick it up, they create an identical corporation, and in your name, equivalent to your name, just like the United States was equivalent to the United States, right, of America, and capitalize it. That's why your Social Security card and your birth certificates are all capitals. That's the certificate for your corporation. And you, the person, and you, the corporation, exist legally. And so a lot of these sovereign individual people you see will say, it's me, the person, and not me, the corporation, right? Because they know a little bit about the law, and they're properly dismissed as crazy and jailed anyways. And that's sort of the way those type of conspiracies actually get some merit, right? So general view is you are a free sovereign individual, and stuff like Social Security is something we all agreed to, that we will helps fund our retirement planning and stuff like that, and makes accountabilities for taxes and whatnot, so for the common good, right? But in conjunction with the U.S. corporation made in 1871 and the bankruptcy in 1933, the international bankers wanted pretty heavy stipulations to fund the American economy, and we were pretty desperate. We had little choice. So, Wilson originally, but then FDR eventually, they settled with the international bankers to set up a system where we would get money, and on behalf of that, we didn't have a lot of collateral, so we pledged the property, the citizens and its property, all future and current, against the collateral of the debt. So that's kind of weird. Like, why would you ever agree to that? But, there's a lot of money to be made by everybody who knows that, right, who was in that, and then you needed to control people centrally anyways, and so it was all about heavy government, so it really wasn't that bad of a deal for those on the inside. And the rest of us, we just set it up like, we're not actual slaves, but we are. Don't pay your taxes, or don't, avoid your Social Security stuff, and see what happens to you, because they want that money. So at birth, again, the Social Security system began in 1835, so right after the 1833, as quickly as you can get it through Congress. That got into things, so we all got numbers and names. Before that, they were on a different system, so we got numbers and names, and then a lot of people have come up with this theory that it's at birth you get a dual, again, the dual purpose of the SS Corp is to put a corporation with your name and a unique number, and this allows a generation for some $600,000 to $700,000 to $600,000, almost $700,000 worth of debt that now can be incurred in your name and is loaned out to the United States of America, and you'll be paying that back, right? So over your lifetime is the expectation on average with the average U.S. citizens, and so it's a way to keep loaning money to those private funds and individuals that fund the government, and keep it going, and keep the whole debt stream going, and make those super powerful people even more powerful. So the alternate view is following maritime law, cargo-like documentation is created against you, against your person, incorporated as property of the U.S. against the debt of you and your ancestors and your future, right? So you were born into this, most people nowadays, but they sold you out back in the day. That's the theory. And if I guess you could leave and go to another country, I guess I'll have to do a little more research on that one, right? But for the most part, don't pay your taxes and see what happens. Don't pay your debt. So I'll take a little detour. It's the American women's right to vote. Really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the mainstream I was going, but this is a conspiracy that comes up all the time. And the general view, especially in this year where we got Clinton going to be president, and the American whole suffrage comes up, American suffrage, and the right to vote. Clearly they won, American women won their long battle, hard-fought battle for voting rights in the 1920, right? So that's the year that women could first vote in America. And they, you'll see the videos online right now about suffrage and tracing it back to like 1848, probably earlier, right? But they didn't give any credit in those videos. But decades went by, and maybe even centuries, without a whole lot of winning or fighting on behalf of American women. By contrast, there was a big fight to free Negro men. That's called the Civil War. A lot of people died in that. So I guess you can fight in different manners, but usually to fight for freedom, you got to have some sacrifices. And so I don't know what American women were sacrificing. Who knows, right? But they weren't very successful until 1920. But if you look at worldwide women voting and suffrage, first voting women were definitely New Zealand in 1893, and from 1905 to 19 there was a whole bevy of international countries. It's kind of in fad. We're initiating voting rights for women. I've never figured out why they were doing it. Maybe it's just time in the world, or maybe there's these international bankers wanted voting people so that they could claim them as collateral, or whatever the heck the thing is that were coming up. Maybe they were smarter than us. I don't know why. Maybe it was just the time. But anyways, clearly there was a whole bunch of them. In fact, in terms of major countries that we think of as free, America was one of the last, so they weren't the leaders. They were definitely the followers. American women didn't lead out anything. Probably had some protests when other people were protesting, and other countries were getting it from 1905 to 1909. And I talk about like the Norways, the Denmarks, even Germany, Russia. Countries. Most of those countries were ahead of us. So it's like, hey, all these other people are getting it. Well, make a little protest here and put it in. I don't even know if women protested for it, but I guess the videos say they do. So. But other major countries in the world we think are free. America was one of the last ones. Britain, Spain, and France were after. Of course, we have non-free people like China that, and stuff like that we don't think of as typically as free. But Russia we don't think of as free. But, they definitely were ahead of us with women's voting. So, not the leaders, right? I'm not positive women even wanted to vote. 1964, after they won their right in 1920 to vote, they definitely had a majority. They could have just voted, right? But it took until 1964 was the first year that women voters outnumbered men. in terms of numbers. And in 1980 was the first year the percentage of women voters was greater than men. So I don't know how enthusiastic women were about voting, but those were the numbers say. That tells me it's not terribly enthusiastic, unless they were strong-armed into not voting by their husbands. I don't know. Come on, that's another conspiracy theory altogether. So, but since 1964, women have definitely been the majority of voters in America. They control everything, and as of the last election, I think they were 71 million voters versus 61 million voters. Women versus men, so a pretty significant amount. Women responsible for everything since 1964, right? In 1980, so that all those years after, it's been all women. So congratulations, got the right to vote. But basically, the alternate view is that our friends in the world were doing it, and America just followed, and not a lot of hard-fought stuff there. But I don't know where that sits. Let's go to the next one. Hitler, bound to be a controversial one. Again, here's where the first craziness comes out, right? The general view is that Hitler was a crazy man who hated Jews for no reason except for political gain, period, right? So to control the classes. Yeah, I think we most agree. He had some pretty extreme methodologies, right? So Hitler likely was a diabolical madman. I guess that's my opinion, right? Taking it out on basically religion, but you can do race and nationality. Jews were not the only deaths, right, that Hitler, he basically wanted to take out Poland, right, and make that for expansion. He was basically divvying that up with Russia. His buddy Stalin, who was a big killer in his lifetime, he's just had gulags and executed all kinds of people, internal people out. Look up Russia sometime on the way they killed forever. I mean, you do say something wrong, they take you down in the basement of I forget, the Kremlin, right? And they wax you. They actually had like drains and stuff to get the blood out easy. So they were pretty efficient killers, and I'm sure Hitler was partnered with Stalin, and they were going to divvy up the eastern land. So I think Hitler was just going to kill everybody in Poland because that was the land that was divvied up for him, and that was for future expansion. So why leave they was going to leave a small population of non-Jews, right? Because that would be slaves, basically, the Slavics. He wanted to get rid of the Slavics too, but some of the Aryans, so that the Aryans would have slaves in their new land, their expanding land out to the east. And that was how the World War II eventually started. So Hitler definitely stated he hated what the American Jewish bankers and their counterparts, because the Jews controlled the banking in Germany. Definitely as a youngster hated what they did to the economy, particularly the American Jewish bankers that controlled the purse strings over there, in his mind, and probably true also. Definitely America. And the International Banking Fund at that time was driving everybody in the late 20s, right, into bankruptcy, and all the Aryans and were all second-class citizens to the Jewish bankers, and Jewish bankers were taking all the good jobs. Jewish people in general were taking all the good jobs in Germany. So I guess he had reason to do that. Hitler and Stalin were partners and adopted the Gulag system. Yeah, definitely. Although you're going to tell me right now that Russia was on our side, right? Well, not initially. Look it up, right? It's not until Stalin kind of went over a certain line, because they had divvied up all of that stuff, and he went over a certain line, and then Hitler eventually wanted Russia anyways. He just didn't tell him, so Hitler backstabbed Stalin and went on an invasion, and then definitely Stalin said, well, I'll look for the next best. And when it was clear that the German forces weren't going to be enough, they had a couple million people on their eastern front and a million people on their western front, and yeah, they got out to France, but once people like America got involved, and there was going to be, I think the end of them numbers, there was 6 million, Soviets that were going to take from the east against 2 million, and like 4 million Americans against 1 million. So pretty clear that Hitler wasn't going to win. He just teamed up with the Allies, and again was looking for the same. Eventually got his land. The Eastern Bloc went to Soviet Union or Russia. So he actually got what he wanted, so he just played the field after Hitler backstabbed him. So look that up. But Hitler planned on clearing Poland for German expansion and sharing the Eastern Bloc with Russia. And so he was just going to kill everybody in Poland, and it just happened that most of Poland was Jews. Matter of fact, most of the Jews that were killed were not German Jews. They were Polish Jews. Like over 3 million of them were Polish Jews. So it was pretty easy to pick it on that front too, because it lined up with his Aryan masterpiece to go out there and Aryan race stuff. So I don't know if they weren't a lot of Jews in Poland. Who knows what he would have picked on? But he killed all kinds of any deformed people and any non-Aryan, basically any mixed. He would have, so maybe would have come up with a different reason for that. But again, his methodology was what made him the madman, along with Stalin. But hypocritical Americans, I call that, right, are the kings of genocide, by the way. So we're talking about genocide here, right? Killing off race, religion, nationalities based upon looks or whatever. And we're definitely the kings of genocide. Well, what makes, we have the most wars. Thinking if you're an Native American Indian, you know exactly what we're talking about, right? And Americans we put all the Japanese in America into gulags or whatever, concentration camps, right? But we just didn't kill them. So we weren't quite as mean, as nasty. But we definitely rounded up all the Japanese, put them in camp like prisoners, just like the Germans. But it's slightly different because we didn't invade. We took our Japanese and put them in there. We didn't, invade a certain country in which we'd be more likely to kill them. So don't think that we're too far above Hitler at the end of the day, but I'm not going to make Hitler to be out a saint. That's definitely not my intention here, so don't get me wrong. German and Russian banking Jews oppressed the Aryan race, and the revolution was the course. So that's alternate view. I don't know. Interesting times. I'm going to jump a number of decades in this last few ones because I spent some time. This is one I just threw in there, but there was obviously a Kennedy assassination that has a lot of CIA type conspiracy theories, right? And grassy knolls and film disappearing and whatever, magic bullets. That's well played out, but I don't think there's enough to talk about there. But the Reagan assassination was kind of glossed over in life, and it's kind of interesting when you get into it. So the general view is that a crazy John Hinckley Jr. Shot Reagan after becoming infatuated with the movie Taxi Cab. That's a De Niro movie where he seeks out to kill the president. And Jodie Foster apparently plays a prostitute in there, and he was obsessed with Jodie Foster and stalked her and that type of stuff, right? So he was crazy. Again, that word crazy comes up again, right, with conspiracy theories. So crazy John Hinckley Jr. Shot Reagan and spent his time. I think he just got out recently or whatever. They just transferred him somewhere. But what was interesting is, George Herbert Walker Bush, or George Bush Sr., right, was a long CIA asset, had a lot of ties to CIA. Interestingly enough, like he was, there's a George Bush they were seeking later on in Dallas, that was in Dallas during the Kennedy Association, and he denied being there. And of course, there was another airman. They said it was another airman named George Bush was there, and the other airman said, no, I wasn't there. So it's like, there's a lot of, was he there? Why is he lying, right? Or whatever it was. Well, there's a lot of cover up with that CIA-wise. So he's a long CIA guy. But anyways, because of his CIA background, he was pretty controlling during the Reagan administration. A lot of people say Reagan was more of a puppet head, and behind the scenes, there were a lot of what do you call them? Committees or whatever you want to call it, right? That were formed during that time, mostly to defeat other countries in the world. About 8 days prior to the attempt, Mr. George Bush Sr. there, Herbert Walker, was given, as vice president, he was given unprecedented authority to the VP position. So he could basically step in and take the presidency. I know most people think the vice president steps in and takes the presidency normally, but normally it's a lame duck type thing, and he doesn't have all the controls that a president has. But because this guy had a lot of CIA background and he was working behind the scenes, they said that he was qualified to do some of these tasks. So 8 days prior to the attempt, out of curiosity, he was given that authority officially in some House resolution or whatever it was, presidential order or whatever. I think it's presidential order. But where it gets real interesting is John Hinckley Sr., father of John Hinckley Jr., was an influential figure in the oil industry. We all know Bushes are oil people, right? And Hinckley was a Vanderbilt oil magnate. He also had supported Bush, the maximum contribution he could put every year legally, and probably illegally he probably did other stuff. So he basically was supporting Bush throughout his political career. And then lo and behold, so it's just a big coincidence, right? But it was very plausible that he attempted to take out Reagan pretty early there and then just get his agenda on the way. He ended up being president anyways, but that wasn't a guarantee, right, back early in those days. So, interesting, and that the attempt was orchestrated from the inside, basically. Interesting. So my last big conspiracy is the 9/11 being an inside job, and there are hours upon hours, videotapes, talks, and more as the years go by, this gets even more ground. So it's a interesting subject, but the general view is that Islamic terrorists hijacked 4 planes and crashed them into the World Trade 1, World Trade 2, and the Pentagon, and the fourth one fell in Pennsylvania, right? And mysteriously, World Trade 7 fell from being weakened from the fall of Trade 1 or Trade 2, right? Some say that fourth plane was intended for World Trade 7 to crash into it and bring it down, and we'll see. Motivation appears to be the hatred of Americans, right? So these Islamic terrorists living in a cave, infiltrated our airspace, some of the most heavily guarded airspace in the world, in Washington D.C. especially, and by luck of the draw, crashed into these things. But so George Sr., George Herbert Walker Bush, secured $250 billion in bonds to fund the Russian financial toppling, and he did that on September 11th, 1991, so 10 years before the World Trade Center attack. And they were illegal bonds, hush fund money. Some people have come out on this, and it's been somewhat, all the records are gone, obviously, but somewhat interesting pattern, and some talk has come out, and so it's just hard to spill the beans. We get more and more spilling beans in the world now. It's harder to keep information secret, but definitely that number was 250 billion, legal slush fund stuff and it's called the Black Eagle Trust went way before us. I'll look up Black Eagle Trust Fund sometime, or look up this 240 billion for 9/11. But it was it was a 10-year bond, and so those need to be accounted for, or they need to be paid or accounted for or reconciled, right? On 9/12, the day after the attacks, they would have been needed to be reconciled or recorded, and either reissued or drawn in or whatever. That's the way bonds and funds work, because they were legit bonds, hidden, whatever. So interestingly enough, the main targeted hits by the planes, in terms of, you can do it by death percentages of the companies that people worked, and they actually hit the floors right below these 2 offices. There were 2 global security brokers in the towers. There are actually 3, but the 2 were the most heavily hit. I don't have the names here, but you can look the names online. Pretty line. Most people have this stuff out there. And so those most likely to issue those type of bonds, right, those $240 billion in bonds, were targets in the trade centers. And the Naval Office in the Pentagon was also a target, and that Naval Office would be the one investigating those $240 billion worth of missing bonds. And in addition, that Naval Office was really investigating 2.3 trillion in missing general funds. So 2.3 trillion in missing general funds. And that came out, I think it was Rumsfeld or wherever, the day before, like 9/10. There's a thing talking about how that office is investigating bad accounting practices and missing 2.3 trillion. And so the next day, 39 of the 40 people died that were in that office investigating in the Pentagon. Some of the other people got moved out, so really they were the only ones occupying that new construction area. And kind of interesting coincidence, I'm sure, right? The airspace on 9/11 was running a hijack drill, and the planes that were really close, so there's a lot of centers, a lot of Air Force bases that are close to Washington, D.C. and New York. Those planes were out. So those planes were out doing hijack drills or down and about or in other areas. So they weren't close enough to respond in a timely manner to the downtown New York or the Pentagon. And so they had to, pull planes from out in Cape Cod area in Massachusetts, and the other one was down in Virginia or something. I forgot the exact place. But both those planes were sent to intercept targets. One was east of New York, and the other one, the planes went out east over the ocean, right, away from D.C. despite the fact that they were known that there was a hijacking in place, right? At least like an hour before, right? So both planes responding were directed elsewhere. I'm sure that's just a coincidence, right? And the hijacking drill was just a coincidence, right? That brought out all the people. So over an hour existed in D.C. with a known hijacking threat before the plane came in, the one that hit allegedly the Pentagon. And Cheney, you can hear Cheney on tape doing the guy asks about reacting to that plane coming in. I think they're 30 clicks out or whatever, 30 miles. And he says, no, stand down, do as normal, right? So it's very interesting. I'm sure just a coincidence, right? Multiple counts of thermite in use. Jet fuel does not melt steel. I mean, that's been pretty proven. So the thermite produces the white smoke. The jet fuel produces the black smoke. Go back and watch the video. And lots of other people have accounts of thermites found in the ground, right? So thermite would cut the steel. Jet fuel won't. No matter, it just doesn't burn hot enough in wide open, never mind confined spaces. And a lot of people say the jet fuel that would have been on the plane would have got consumed in the initial fireball. Just no way that a jet of that size and weight brings down those towers. So I don't know if they planned on that, but I don't know if it could. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but that's part of the believing. There's also a lot of unusual power outages in the weeks before, particularly at nighttime, between the hours of 3 and 5, and there were nightly reports of trucks pulling up from 3 to 5. Of course, the power outages cut the security filming cameras, and the cleaning crews were denied entry at that time, something a practice that they typically did. So interesting that the weeks leading up, all those three factors came in, and so the theory behind that is that that's where they put the thermite on the central columns under the cover of darkness and power outages and other people, no witnesses, right? So interesting. And another very coincidental thing was the SEC was operating remotely that day. Usually it's in the World Trade Center, but they were operating remotely that day. And in the days that follow, the SEC used its emergency powers to allocate the bond debt as destroyed. Basically, it was lost and destroyed, and it wouldn't need to be investigated, reported, or reconciled. And they'll issue new debt. They'll replace it with new bonds, and that's sort of washing your hands. So the SEC was in on it. That's the alleged conspiracy. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about that. So the alternate view is that it was an inside job, and the cavemen in the Middle East could not pull this off. No freaking way. So interesting to look at. And I have a related 9/11 in that no planes hit anything. Now, I don't know why they would go through the trouble of not having planes hit anything, because now you got all these witnesses, unless the planes were full of conspirators, right? I mean, it's kind of weird that no planes hit anything, but a lot of people get stuck up on it. Maybe that's a diversion tactic, but the general view, it's clear on TV. You see it clearly hitting the towers in low def, not high def, although the ones in the ground shot from below seem to have a little better. The one that's in the helicopter is pretty fuzzy, right? Could be anything. But not much of the video of live original content exists. Clearly they've been doctored and altered, and these people, a lot of YouTube videos and stuff, they just show how it's been doctored and altered, and it's very curious. There weren't that many, stuff on it, but so by the time the second plane hit, I think there'd be a lot of video, but it turns out there's only X number of video, so nobody's come out yet with an original video, right? The wide shot in the helicopter has no plane, despite the fact that the timing and the speed and everything else says it would have been in that wide. There's a 3-focus wide shot. It goes tight, wide, tight, tighter. And the people who do video stuff explain that. But there's no plane in the wide shot. My theory is it could be above, it could have been too high at that point because it did swing down, but I don't know. It's definitely not there in the wide shot, and it would have been seeable. Video experts in live T composite insertion, which is what they say how it was done, with live composite insertion, show the inconsistency in the video and the apparent errors in the manipulation techniques. So they've trying to sort of explain this is how it would look if they screwed it up, and this is how it looks, right? Very few witnesses both heard and saw the planes. I think there was 8 witnesses or something that both heard and saw. Some people heard it, some people saw it. Very few heard and saw it. I don't know how you don't. Allegedly, again, the plane is at full throttle, right? How do you not hear a full throttle plane at 800 feet? You go around your airport from 3 miles away, you'll hear an airplane taking off. You know, a jet like that, not even a 767, a smaller 737 you'll hear. So interesting. Damage is very inconsistent with the impact expectation, especially in the wings. So that one where you see the plane go in the wings, the wings go in and they make a hole, sort of they call it the cartoon character, like the Roadrunner going through a wall, right, or the Wile E. Coyote. Those lightweight aluminum planes that aren't even aluminum wing tips that aren't even capable of carrying fuel, barely carry the lights out at the tips, right? Slice through concrete and steel pillars at 200, 300 miles an hour. It just not going to happen, right? And you didn't see anything on the plane start to buckle like a car hitting a wall, right? You see all this buckling. You expect the aluminum fuselage to be buckling back, and you don't see any of that. So it's very, very convincing when they talk about the plane was inserted in the video. And whether or not something hit the tower like a drone or a secret ball, as some of the conspiracy, or if it was just an explosion. A lot of the early reports were just an explosion with no plane. A lot of people didn't report the plane hitting. There's a weird bulge on the bottom of the second plane. So if you ever get the bottom shot, people say, a lot of people who are pilots say, what the hell's that bulge down there? And people say it was an offsetting mistake error when they inserted a plane that doesn't look like an American plane, looks like a shadow plane, right? Speed reported is impossible at altitude. A lot of people say it's traveling at 550 miles an hour. I can do that at 30,000 feet, but you can't do that at 800 feet. The air's too thick. Rip the wings off. So there's some inconsistencies in the speed that's been reported. The plane nose clearly pops out, and then there's shots of the building after that doesn't look like a plane nose went through it, right? So interesting. Pentagon video is definitely sketchy. And that came out weeks after, right? And I still don't, nobody sees a plane in it, right? Weird live interviews, if you ever get to see that, review that one. That one's pretty awesome. That they have some government-looking guys in the background, like standing around, and then the guy comes over to the live video, the controlled media, and says, "Oh well, I can see that the plane weakened the central core." Some stuff you wouldn't say, you wouldn't know. You'd be like, "Oh, the plane, I see plane hit tower," right? Instead it's like, well, clearly the jet fuel spilled out and weakened the inner core, and then the inner core collapsed upon itself and an implosion. It's like, what is this guy, an expert? It's almost planted. It's almost chaotic, right? Coincidence, right? World Trade Center. This is a beautiful one, the BBC. If you go look at that one, where 23 minutes before it collapsed, the lady's on the air talking about, "Oh, we just got reports the World Trade 7 collapsed," and you look over her shoulder and it's there, right? It's from a distance, but people identified it. It's there. I don't know if it's another building. I don't know if people say, "Oh, it was there," and then 24 minutes later, so the BBC screwed up the timing of the conspiracy, right? The Pennsylvania crash scene is very inconsistent with a plane crash. There's almost nothing's there, right? If you look at it, right? There's no crash plane. Well, it's going so fast it disintegrated, right? But then it's got, by the way, we found bandanas and one of the terrorists' passport, and we found this other guy's license. The license is like 2 years expired, but whatever. Like all this stuff survived, right? But the plane was obliterated, right? And the crash is just totally inconsistent. People initially, right out of the gate, said, "Man, that's not a crash of that size," right? So it's kind of interesting. Additionally, the plane transponder reported signal quite a few miles away, closer to Pittsburgh, right, or whatever, like 15 minutes later. So there's a big conspiracy that the planes were swapped on the radar feeds, right? That somebody brought in these fake drone type stuff and landed the original planes. I don't know what they did, Area 51 the people, but it's not explained, so I don't know if I believe that one. Of course, Bush is very adamant that he saw the first plane hit on TV, and then he read the book, and then there was a report of another one, and it's like, well, there was no live feed, at least none that we saw, right? Of course, Bush knows about the two internets and everything, so what the heck's going on here? Because nobody got a live shot of the first view. He's very adamant he saw the first view, so I don't know if he got his story wrong with his goofy character, but yep. So the alternate view is that video technicians had the capability and had 5 to 10 minutes to doctor up the video and do a quick insertion, and that had some pretty fatal flaws, but the average American would believe it. And so that's it on my conspiracy theories. I know it's been a long video and not very exciting. I'm not going to show the video, but you can go off for hours and hours on some of this stuff. But I don't know where it brings you in the world. Doesn't do a lot for me, but I guess it's eye-opening, right, in certain regards, and it gets a little more credible as events go on. So enjoyed it. See ya.